an adventurer. He is a warrior with a sacred artifact in his hands who fights demons and monsters in order to protect people. When an adventurer saved cities, he was revered as a hero, and achievements were passed on to descendants. A young boy was reading a book and uttering words about the hero with a wide and joyful smile on his face. However, suddenly some children snatched a book about adventurers from the hands of that cute boy. That surprised boy froze and bulged his eyes in shock, thinking to himself at this moment that since childhood he had dreamed of heroes, as in that book. Suddenly, those evil boys started laughing loudly at that boy. One of those angry boys grinned and asked the surprised kid if he was really reading his book alone again. The second boy opened the book and began to laugh angrily, asking the young book lover if he was really reading books about the hero again. Then that other boy pulled his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and smiled broadly, telling the rest of his friends out loud that this was a story about a guy who was weak, but got a strong artifact and became a hero. That boy immediately asked the kid with the book if this was true. After that, those evil children began to laugh loudly and asked that boy if he really wanted to become a hero. To which one of those hooligans laughed and said in an angry voice that this boy would not become a hero because he simply did not have the courage to do it. It was on that day that the dreamy boy with the book stopped dreaming about it. It was on that day that the boy seriously set out to become an adventurer. Seriously thinking about it, that boy smiled confidently and began to mumble. However, at this moment, a girl suddenly appeared next to them. Stamping her foot, that girl immediately screamed loudly, telling those boys to return the book to the future adventurer. Those little hooligans immediately froze in shock, and one of them screamed in horror, informing the others that there was a girl named Ruby in front of them. Remembering little Ruby's face, that boy with the book concluded to himself that it was this girl who gave him the opportunity to become an adventurer. Suddenly, the same boy who had already matured and become a young man slowly opened his eyes after waking up and called Ruby by name in a sleepy voice. Opening his eyes, the young man saw in front of him a surprised girl, who was the same Ruby. Hearing the young man calling her name, Ruby broke out in drops of cold sweat and screamed, calling the young man named Ratsu in a nervous voice and wishing him good morning. To which Ratsu, in a sleepy voice, wished Ruby a good morning in response. However, just 1 second later, Ratsu abruptly jumped up from his seat and, covered with drops of cold sweat from shock, screamed, asking Ruby why she was in his room. Ruby immediately blushed with embarrassment and began to wave her hands, simultaneously trying to justify herself. Then Ruby gathered her thoughts and smiled broadly. Pointing at the door, Ruby shouted with a wide smile on her face that she had been knocking on the door for a very long time, but the young man did not answer her. After that, Ruby pointed her index finger at the window and reported that this was why she climbed in the window. Ruby became slightly nervous and screamed, simultaneously informing the young man that she had been told to wake him up. After listening to Ruby's shout of explanation, Ratsu rubbed his aching head and sighed heavily. Noticing Ratsu's displeased expression, Ruby blushed slightly again and with a wide smile on her face suggested that the young man get ready faster, since today was the long-awaited blessing ceremony. Ratsu immediately broke into a pleased smile when he realized that today was the day of the ceremony where children who have reached the age of 12 receive sacred treasures from God. After some time, the adult woman informed Ruby and Rats that she could not go with them. Then that adult woman addressed Ruby by name and told her to take care of Ratsu. Ruby immediately leveled off and confidently informed the woman that, as an older sister, she would take care of the young man. Ratsu privately concluded at that moment that they were, in fact, the same age as his older sister named Ruby. After some time, Ruby and Ratsu came to the church, which already had a large crowd of people. Ruby immediately blushed with joy and screamed loudly, concluding aloud that there were so many people in the church that now this ceremony was more like a festival. Ruby noticed with joy in her voice that she was just delighted. Ratsu smiled slightly and told Ruby that she was acting like she was a little kid. Continuing to walk down the street, Ruby asked Rats about the fact that the young man had been reading until morning again. Then Ruby noticed the fact that Ratsu had been looking forward to this day. Ruby also drew attention to the fact that she absolutely cannot believe that a young man managed to oversleep such an important day for him. Ratsu nodded in response. After a few moments, Ruby announced with a slight tremor in her voice that she was nervous. Ratsu was very surprised and immediately asked Ruby about her nervousness. Ruby looked up at the sky and said in a thoughtful voice that she was nervous, since this ceremony takes place only once in a lifetime. Upon hearing this, Ratsu immediately began to panic and become very nervous. The young man sighed heavily and began to wonder in a trembling voice about what would happen if he received a strange sacred treasure. Ruby immediately winked at her younger brother and said that there was only a small chance. Happily hitting her younger brother named Ratsu in the side with her elbow, Ruby's older sister smiled broadly and told the young man in an encouraging voice that the boys in the village treated them badly, so it would be good for Ratsu and Ruby to get something cool and surprise everyone. Ratsu only nodded nervously in response. At that moment, the young man concluded to himself that he could not say anything in response. Suddenly, Ruby and Ratsu froze when they heard someone's voice nearby. When Ruby and Ratsu listened, they heard a young man talking about how if his interlocutor gets a C rank or higher, he will become an adventurer. When his interlocutor asked with a smile on his face that wasn't this young man going to run a fruit store, the guy immediately leveled off and with a satisfied smile on his face said that, as he assumes, he will receive something no lower than rank D. Ruby and Ratsu continued to look at those with surprise two young men. Glancing to the side, Ruby and Ratsu opened their mouths in shock when they heard two girls blushing with joy and embarrassment talking about something. After listening, Ruby and Ratsu heard one of these girls, in a joyful and very excited voice, begin to say that she would rather be protected by adventurers than become an adventurer herself. To which her friend replied with firm agreement. Upon hearing this, Ratsu raised his eyebrows in shock and concluded aloud with surprise in his voice that, apparently, there are those who do not want to become adventurers at all. The young man also noticed the fact that a lot of different people participate in the anniversary of growing up. The older sister named Ruby also raised her eyebrows in surprise and completely agreed with Ratsu's words. Ratsu, suddenly surprised, glanced to the side and, looking closely at the crowd of people, concluded to himself that these people did not look familiar to him. Ratsu immediately suggested that these might be the same adventurers. Glancing to the side, Ratsu said out loud the words that if a person was invited here directly by the adventurer himself, then this person can become an adventurer without even passing the exam. Ratsu gripped his favorite hero book tightly in his hand. Noticing this, Ruby smiled slightly and asked Rats if he remembered the promise. Then Ruby slightly pulled her eyebrows to the bridge of her nose and said in a confident voice that they should protect people from demons. Ratsu immediately furrowed his brows and added in a confident voice the words that he and Ruby should become the coolest heroes by becoming adventurers. The confident Ruby and Ratsu uttered the last words in unison. Suddenly, Ruby and Ratsu heard the voice of a young man shouting that it was true and he had seen everything. Ruby and Ratsu took a look at the crowd and saw the young man shouting with excitement in his voice, informing the others that there was no doubt about it. Then that young man started saying something about the hero. Upon hearing this, Ratsu immediately asked about the hero in shock. Worried, Ruby began to talk very loudly about the fact that this is a title that is given only to the strongest adventurer. Hearing Ruby's voice, the guys from the crowd began to wave and call her by name, simultaneously informing her that they had been looking for her for a long time. One girl from the crowd called Ruby by name and shouted that she was late. Then the guys from the crowd smiled and shouted, simultaneously announcing that the ceremony would begin soon. An older sister named Ruby waved her hand to her younger brother Rats and informed him that she would step away for a second. The young man smiled slightly and waved back at Ruby. At this moment, Ratsu concluded to himself that his older sister Ruby has many friends, and the young man himself is a shy young man and lonely, just the complete opposite of Ruby. Suddenly, someone bumped Ratsa with his shoulder. The young man came out of his thoughts and looked towards that rude man in shock. Turning around, the young man with blonde hair pulled his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and shouted in an angry voice, asking Ratsu for forgiveness for not noticing such a little thing. Then this young man curled his eyebrows and asked Rats in a loud voice what it was and if the young man was also going to go to the ceremony. Folding his hands in front of him, that blonde young man began to mock Ratsu and shout that a weakling like this young man hoped to get an artifact. The young man with blonde hair continued to shout, with cunning in his voice, asking Rats if he really thought he could fight. Then this young man made an evil expression on his face again and asked Ratsa if this young man really didn't think that it was pointless for him to come here. Ratsu, on the other hand, broke into a nervous smile and laughed uncertainly, simultaneously agreeing with that blonde young man. After that blonde young man abruptly snatched that book out of Ratsu's hands and, simultaneously waving this book from side to side, began to ask the young man if Ratsu was still reading this book. Ratsu shuddered and immediately fell silent. While Ratsu was smiling nervously and pursing his lips, that young man with blonde hair pulled his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and began to ask Ratsu what the young man really thinks that he can become a hero if he gets a strong artifact. Seeing Ratsu's nervous smile, that blonde young man said that Ratsu was indeed an ordinary child. Ratsu began to break out in drops of cold sweat due to his excitement. However, at that very moment, someone grabbed the arm of that young man with blonde hair. Knitting her eyebrows to the bridge of her nose from the overflowing anger, Ruby tightly squeezed the hand of that blonde young man, and then screamed, telling him to give the book back. Ratsu made a surprised expression on his face and called Ruby's name in a low voice. The blonde-haired young man loudly clucked, and, making an expression of complete displeasure, relaxed his hand and threw the book on the floor. Knitting his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose, the blonde young man noticed with displeasure in his voice the fact that Ruby had come to his head. As he was about to leave and cast a last glance in the direction of Ratsu and Ruby, that blonde young man tessed and shouted loudly that the coward whom the woman was protecting was not worthy of possessing the artifact. Ratsu immediately lowered his very sad gaze down and began to try to justify himself, simultaneously thinking to himself at this moment about how pathetic he was. At that moment, Ruby lowered her hands to Ratsu's book and immediately told her younger brother that he did not need to do this. Ruby then told her younger brother named Ratsu not to say anything in response. Holding out the book, Ruby smiled broadly and asked Rats if it was true that the young man was going to become a cool hero after all. Hearing this, Ratsu bulged his shiny eyes and blushed slightly from embarrassment, silently concluding that Ruby understood his feelings. After some time, Ruby and Ratsu finally reached the church and entered the building. When a large crowd gathered, the Holy Father stepped onto the pedestal and in a loud voice suggested that the blessing ceremony begin. Adjusting his glasses, the Holy Father immediately informed that those who undergo the ritual should approach the altar. At the same moment, Ratsu, trembling with excitement, opened his book and began to read aloud in an excited voice the words that once a year, on the day when the sacred light comes from the sun, the main character managed to have a dialogue with God. Ruby immediately screamed, calling Rats by name and announcing that the blessing ceremony was beginning. At that moment, a blonde young man with slicked back hair flexed his fists and announced in a confident voice that he would go first. Then that blonde guy walked up to the altar. The Holy Father then ordered us to pray. The blonde-haired young man folded his hands in front of him and began to recite a prayer to himself. Suddenly, at the same second, bright streams of sunlight from the windows began to fill the church, blinding all the parishioners. The crowd of people immediately began to squint because of the bright streams of light. However, suddenly Ratsu and other people in the crowd stopped covering their eyes with their hands. Ratsu noticed aloud the fact that this was a blessing ceremony. At the same moment, the same blonde guy, having become a real adventurer, received the C rank and a large steel axe. In addition, that young man with the slicked back blonde hair also had a first level, a whole 100 points of sacred power, and a skill called Two-Handed Strike. Seeing this, Ruby covered her mouth with her hand in shock. That nasty and angry guy just chuckled. At that moment, that young man at the altar loudly announced to everyone that he had a C rank and a large steel axe. Some people in the crowd were covered in drops of cold sweat from shock and began to wonder aloud whether this was serious, and did that young man really have a C rank? The priest stepped forward and, waving his hand to the side, announced that the newly minted adventurers would be able to learn the full power of their weapons when they equipped the sacred artifact. The Holy Father also asked the rest of the future adventurers from the crowd to report that they had received the sacred treasure, if that happened. That mischievous blonde young man slightly furrowed his eyebrows and wanted to comment on the situation. But suddenly the girl with the square raised her hand up and screamed in an excited voice, asking the Holy Father if she could try it now. After receiving permission, that girl walked up to the altar. And after a few moments, she found out that she had received the Dagger of the Storm and the rank of C. Also, that girl found out that now she has the first level. The sacred power is equal to 80 points, and also this girl received a skill called Sprint. Upon seeing this, Ratsu immediately concluded out loud that a good harvest was possible this year. At that moment, that disgruntled young man with blonde hair raised his eyebrows and noticed the fact that this was the second person with the rank of C. Upon hearing this, the dark-haired young man in front of him only broke into a wide smile and said that he was just waiting for what would happen next. Glancing sideways at the crowd, Ratsu pursed his lips and concluded to himself that it was not at all surprising that people around were happy, since the treasures were ranked. Ratsu also focused on the ranks of artifacts A, B, C, D, E, F, the average of which is the D rank, and the fact that there are already 2 adventurers with the C rank. At the same moment, Ruby appeared next to Ratsu, who was trembling violently with excitement, and broke into a wide smile, simultaneously informing the young man that she hoped that she and Ratsu would also receive a good artifact. To which Ratsu broke into a very nervous smile and replied with an uncertain agreement. Ratsu noticed to himself at that moment the fact that this is true, and today everything must change. Then the young man concluded about himself, specifically that he is a weakling, a crybaby, who is constantly being bullied, and who needs to change his life. However, Ratsu immediately noticed that in order to change his life, he needed a strong artifact. At that moment, that harmful and very bad young man began to rise to the altar. Upon seeing this, Ratsu immediately broke out in drops of cold sweat and closed his eyes, folding his hands in front of him in a lock. Seeing the strong excitement of her younger brother named Ratsu, Ruby immediately smiled broadly and told the young man not to worry, as she was sure that everything would be fine. At that moment, it was announced from the altar that that blonde-haired hooligan was able to get the B rank and the lightning spear. Also, that blonde young man found out that he had received the first level, sacred power in the amount of 150 points, as well as advantages in the form of plus 120 points of endurance, 170 points of dexterity, 140 points of magic, and 150 points of vitality. In addition to all this, the young man with blonde hair found out that he now has lightning magic, a skill called javelin throwing and strength in the amount of 150 units. After seeing all this, the young people in the crowd immediately began to cheerfully shout that they knew that this would happen, and then began to ask to see that very lightning spear of rank B. When that young man with the lightning spear in his hands began to descend from the pedestal, people in the crowd immediately began to inundate him with questions about whether this young man wanted to become an adventurer, and whether that guy wanted to join their group. Other people in the crowd were also shouting, along the way announcing that they were also inviting this young man to join their adventurer group. He saw Ruby and Ratsa in the crowd, surprised. At the same moment, the young man immediately broke into a sly and smug smile. Ratsu smiled nervously and, calling that young man with blonde hair named Helio, began to talk about how he had been trying hard for a long time, and Helio had always wanted to become an adventurer. Ratsu thought it was all just amazing. Ruby, at that moment, was terribly furious with irritation and injustice. Then Ruby abruptly walked towards the altar and shouted loudly, simultaneously announcing that she would receive a sacred treasure that would be much cooler. Ratsu, in a joyful voice, wished his older sister Ruby good luck. Going up to the altar, the girl bowed to the Holy Father and announced that her name was Ruby Blood. Then Ruby Blood thanked the Holy Father and began to pray. Ratsu, at that moment, wondered if Ruby Blood noticed his feelings. Ratsu suddenly began to remember that when he was little, he always read books. It was because of this that Ratsu was always alone. Remembering how little Helio and his friends constantly bullied him as a child, Ratsu recalled one situation. Ratsu began to remember again how Helio's friends had asked little Ratsu if he really wanted to be the last hero. Helio himself pointed his index finger at baby Ratsu and began shouting in a rude voice that someone like Ratsu would never become a hero. However, it was at this moment that little Ruby Blood appeared, who screamed sharply and confidently, telling those bad boys led by Helio to return the book to baby Rat. Then little Ruby Blood pulled her eyebrows to the bridge of her nose and screamed loudly, informing the bullies that baby Ratsu could become a hero. That's when Helio and Ruby Blood got into a big fight. Helio called Ruby Blood ugly and told her to keep quiet, to which Ruby Blood screamed back that she would not forgive Helio for this. After that fight, Ruby Blood handed the book to Rats with the words that, as an older sister, she would not be able to protect him forever, so baby Rats must become strong. Ratsu then wiped the bitter tears from his eyes and agreed with every word of his older sister Ruby Blood. Then Ruby Blood suddenly smiled broadly and asked Rats if it wasn't true that he wanted to become a cool hero. Coming out of his thoughts about the past, Ratsu froze and looked intently at Ruby Blood at the altar. At that moment, Ratsu thought that he wanted to be like his older sister. Ruby Blood, suddenly flushed with embarrassment, turned away from the altar and, with uncertainty in her voice, announced that she had received the Sword of the Fiery Dragon of rank A. The crowd of people abruptly fell silent. The church building was filled with dead silence. However, after a few moments, people from the crowd began to shout that the Fire Dragon Sword was an amazing grade artifact. Some people in the crowd just shouted and admired how amazing this artifact was. One person from the crowd shouted that this was the first time this person had seen such an artifact. Ratsu, at that moment, stood in place with eyes glowing with delight and concluded to himself that he now admires his older sister Ruby Blood as a real hero. Ruby Blood, meanwhile, waved at Rats and shouted in a joyful voice, asking him to look at that very powerful artifact. However, as soon as Ruby Blood came down from the podium, she was immediately surrounded by various adventurers and began to ask if this girl wanted to join their group. Other adventurers immediately appeared, who began to dissuade Ruby Blood from joining the first group, and then began to offer to join them altogether. Ruby Blood was covered in drops of cold sweat. Realizing that no one would let her go in the near future, Ruby Blood waved to her younger brother and, calling Rats by name, wished the young man good luck. Just a few moments later, Ratsu began to slowly climb the steps to the pedestal and silently thank Ruby Blood. Once next to the Holy Father, the young man introduced himself by the name of Ratsu. At that moment, Ratsu turned to God and politely asked him to give him strength, the power to be a hero, the power to change the whiny and weak Ratsu so that Helio could not defeat him. The young man asked God to give him the power to help and fight alongside Ruby Blood. Ratsu clasped his hands in a lock and sincerely prayed to God, simultaneously informing him that he needed strength in order to protect his older sister Ruby Blood. At the same moment, a short ray of sunlight suddenly flashed, which only slightly and briefly illuminated the church building. Ratsu opened his eyes in shock and saw a rusty sword in front of him. The crowd of people remained deathly silent, waiting for what would happen next. However, at this moment Helio couldn't help but let out a very loud laugh. Then Helio and his hooligan friends began openly mocking Ratsu and shouting questions about what it was all about and what kind of garbage it was, referring to Ratsu's rusty sword. Ratsu pursed his lips when he realized that the rest of the crowd had picked up the laughter and was just laughing at him. Ruby Blood barely broke through the crowd of people and anxiously called Rats by name. Suddenly, there was a loud clatter of heels. Ruby Blood froze in surprise and glanced towards the source of the sound. The people in the crowd were immediately covered in drops of cold sweat. One of them gasped in shock and started talking about it being her. The other young man next to him slightly furrowed his eyebrows and replied in a loud voice with firm agreement, noting the fact that there could be no mistake. After that, those young people shouted in unison that this was Paludi's hero. The same blonde girl, who was the hero of Paludi, approached Ruby Blood with Ratsu and gave the girl a very stern, studying look. After carefully examining Ruby Blood, Paludi's hero asked the girl if Ruby Blood wanted to join her. When Ruby Blood heard her name, she flinched in shock. People from the crowd immediately opened their mouths in shock, and then began to scream, greatly surprised that Ruby Blood was invited to the group by the hero Paludi herself. One young man from the crowd, with his eyes sparkling with puppy delight, shouted very loudly that Ruby Blood definitely needed to join the group of the hero Paludi. Ruby Blood herself hesitated at the same moment and asked Paludi's character if she really meant her. Paludi's hero, at this time, had already turned around and began to leave, simultaneously asking the surprised girl if there was another Ruby Blood here. Then hero Paludi told Ruby Blood to follow her. Ruby Blood gasped in shock, and then abruptly grabbed the hand of the completely discouraged Ratsu and dragged him along, simultaneously asking the hero Paludi in a polite voice to wait for her. Ratsu tightened his grip on his rusty sword and realized in horror that he had the rank of F. The young man also found out that at his first level, he has only 10 points of sacred power, as well as a complete 0 points of endurance, dexterity, vitality, and magic. In addition to all this, Ratsu found out that he does not possess any skills and magic, and his strength level is only 10 points. Upon learning about all this, and especially about the F rank, the young man was horrified. Ruby Blood turned to Paludi's character at that moment and screamed, politely asking her to let Rats join their group too. Upon hearing this, Paludi's hero stopped and began to carefully examine Ratsu. Seeing the rusty sword in the young man's hands, hero Paludi drew her eyebrows to the bridge of her nose and sighed. Addressing Rats by name, Paludi's hero briefly informed him that the young man would not be able to become an adventurer. Ratsu pursed his lips, gradually realizing all this bitter truth. At this moment, the young man concluded to himself that Paludi's hero was saying everything right, because his rusty sword was the weakest artifact that could be seen. Hero Paludi immediately began to explain her conclusion by saying that demons have hard skin, and magic covers this skin. The hero Paludi also informed the young man that Ratsu would not be able to inflict any wounds with ordinary weapons or a low-rank artifact. After that, the hero Paludi asked the young man if it was true that the rusty sword in his hands, which is an artifact, has the rank of F. Ratsu was silent, and at that moment he thought to himself that the blessing ceremony had completely failed, and the young man himself would be a complete loser for the rest of his life. Palucha's hero summed up her words by saying that if Ratsu goes with her team, he will immediately become prey for demons and monsters. Turning her back on the young man, Paludi's hero asked him to surrender for his own sake. Ruby Blood smiled and said hopefully that they wouldn't know about it until they tried it. Ruby Blood clenched her fists and announced in a confident voice that she would help. Ratsu and Palucha's hero froze. The young man pursed his lips sharply when he heard that Ruby Blood was going to help him. Ratsu, shocked, began to ask Ruby Blood about the fact that she really prefers a young man and not the hero Paludi. Ratsu also asked Ruby Blood in his mind that she would really protect him forever. Looking at Ruby Blood's sweet smile, Ratsu realized abruptly that he just hated it. Recalling how a young man cried as a child because of the situation with the book and Helio, Ratsu concluded that he no longer wanted to be protected, because he had already decided everything that very day. Coming out of his thoughts, Ratsu lowered his head and told Ruby Blood to go ahead and wait for him there. Upon hearing this, Ruby Blood immediately froze in shock. Ratsu explained this by saying that he would take the test himself and become an adventurer. Ruby Blood blushed with excitement and surprise, and then began to ask the young man in a trembling voice about what he was talking about, and remind him about the promise. Ratsu replied in a confident voice that one day he would become an adventurer who would not lose to the heroes. Hearing this, Ruby Blood froze. Ratsu tearfully promised his older sister Ruby Blood that he would become a man who could protect her. Sniffing, Ratsu promised Ruby Blood that he would definitely catch up with her. At that moment, Ruby Blood abruptly remembered how she was attacked by monsters, and baby Ratsu protected her with a scream, telling those monsters to move away from Ruby. That's when the kids Ratsu and Ruby Blood joined hands and began to run away from the monsters with tears of fear in their eyes. It was then that the brave little Ratsu, through tears, told Ruby Blood that she was strong, and those monsters were gone. Continuing to cry, Ratsu smiled broadly and told the roaring Ruby Blood not to cry anymore in that case. Remembering this, Ruby Blood abruptly broke into a warm smile and called Rats the cherished word hero. Then Ruby Blood came closer to Rats and hugged him slightly, stroking his hair with her hands along the way. Hugging the young man, Ruby Blood promised Rats that she would wait for him. Breaking into a sweet smile, Ruby Blood asked Rats to just catch up with her. Also, the older sister noticed that now this is their new promise. Having finished with the goodbyes, Ruby Blood returned to the hero of Paludi. Ratsu's book was lying on the ground. The envious and eternally dissatisfied Helio, looking at this situation, just test. Ratsu saw off the carriage in which his older sister Ruby Blood was riding and privately, addressing Ruby, reflected that he could not fulfill his promise and become an adventurer with his older sister. However, putting on a confident expression, Ratsu pursed his lips and silently noticed the fact that he had made a new promise. The young man also drew attention to the fact that he was given the weakest artifact, but he has not given up yet. Ratsu smiled, noting along the way that his rusty sword was exactly the same, just like Ratsu himself. Then the young man confidently raised his rusty sword to the sky and announced that one day he would definitely become an adventurer. However, after that, Ratsu corrected himself and promised himself out loud to become a hero one day. Ruby Blood, remembering how she spent her entire childhood with Ratsu, drew some conclusions about the young man. Ruby Blood reflected that, unlike the hero of the book, her younger brother named Ratsu was very weak, whiny, and completely unreliable. Ruby Blood also pointed out that Ratsu didn't even have a strong artifact. However, Ruby Blood still considered her younger brother to be her hero. After a certain period of time, an adult Ruby Blood, along with a group of the hero Paludi, fought with monsters that once upon a time attacked the little Ruby and Ratsu. Upon seeing the monster, Ruby Blood screamed loudly to report it, and then abruptly put out her fire dragon sword and prepared to attack. The rest of the adventurers also prepared to attack. However, when she saw only a small dragon that growled at the adventurers, the girl in the hat sighed and told Ruby Blood to calm down, because this is a small monster. To which the adventurer in a white outfit smiled nervously and asked the girl in the hat to forgive Ruby Blood for this. At this moment, the hero Paludi approached Ruby Blood, and in a calm voice informed her that strong monsters do not appear in the forest near the village. Ruby Blood still held her fire dragon sword in her hands and remained silent in response. As she got closer, Paluti's hero noticed that Ruby Blood, covered in drops of cold sweat, was breathing heavily and trembling very much. Hero Paluti lightly touched Ruby Blood's sword and called her name. Lowering the fire dragon's sword to the ground a little, the hero Paluti attracted Ruby Blood's attention and informed her that these little monsters are not those whom adventurers should be afraid of. At the same moment, Ruby Blood came to her senses and froze for a few moments from shock. Then Ruby Blood gasped and, glancing at the Paluti hero, said that she was sorry. Lowering her sword, Ruby Blood leveled up and informed the group of adventurers that she often came to this forest to play with the village children. Noticing that this was an old story, Ruby Blood sighed and sadly expressed her feeling of nostalgia. Suddenly, the hero Paluti asked Ruby Blood about the fact that the girl was really worried about her younger brother Ratsu. Ruby Blood pressed her hand to her chest for a second, and then she turned around and said in a calm voice that this was not quite true. The adventurer in the hat immediately reported that there were no strong monsters in this forest, but still, she did not understand how children could play here, to which Ruby Blood replied that she was being protected from weak monsters. The girl in the hat slightly furrowed her eyebrows and asked Ruby Blood about who was protecting her. Ruby Blood smiled broadly and said with joy in her voice that she was protected by a hero. After some time, an adult woman, apparently Ruby Blood's mom and Ratsu's foster mom, was sweeping the road in front of the house. Noticing the young man, the woman raised her eyebrows in surprise and, calling Rats by name, asked what he was doing here. Ratsu armed himself with a rake and with a wide smile on his face announced that starting today he would help that woman with work on the farm. When the foster mother began to sigh with displeasure, Ratsu began to say that this was natural, because before that he had been raised only by a woman's hand. After finishing talking about all this, Ratsu announced that he was leaving to help with the work on the farm. However, suddenly that woman called Rats by name. Ratsu turned around. The foster mother held a huge rusty sword in her hands and said that Ratsu had forgotten something. Then the woman asked Rats again about whether it was true that the young man wanted to be an adventurer. Ratsu clutched a long rake stick in his hand and agreed with a heavy voice. Upon hearing this, the foster mother broke into a wide smile and asked Rats with joy in her voice that it was not so that then the young man did not have time to do farm work at all. Ratsu's eyes bulged in shock and his mouth opened slightly, still holding the rake in his hands. However, the foster mother abruptly snatched the rake from the young man's hands and put into Ratsu's hands the same artifact in the form of a rusty sword of rank F. Clutching the rake tightly in her hands, the foster mother looked sternly at the young man and asked him to just promise her one thing. Knitting her eyebrows to the bridge of her nose, the foster mother wagged her index finger and told her to run away if it became dangerous. After a certain period of time, Ratsu was already walking through the forest with his rusty sword and concluded to himself that he owed a lot to his mother and Ruby Blood. The young man confidently decided to himself that one day he would definitely repay them for everything. Suddenly Ratsu lowered his surprised gaze to the ground and saw a tire track. The young man immediately noticed that it was an adventurer's carriage. Casting a glance into the distance of the forest, Ratsu silently addressed Ruby Blood by name and confidently decided that he would become an adventurer, no matter how far his older sister went. Suddenly, the young man stopped and scratched his chin thoughtfully, suddenly remembering that a long time ago with him and his older sister Ruby Blood in this forest. However, upon hearing some strange sound, Ratsu immediately wondered what kind of sound it was. Noticing the movement of an object on the ground, the young man began to consider it thoughtfully. However, at the same second, the tree behind Ratsu came to life and began to attack the young man. At the same moment, Ratsu was covered with drops of cold sweat and, with surprise in his voice, shouted the question that it was really Trent. The young man concluded to himself that he had not noticed at all how this monster had crept up on him from behind. At the same moment, that creepy monster abruptly released its vine. He wrapped it around Ratsu's leg. The young man began to fall. Trent abruptly lifted his vine up and hung Ratsa upside down. Ratsu screamed in horror. However, Ratsu then took his rusty sword tighter and decided to try to attack that tree monster in return. But in the end, the attack turned out to be very weak. Ratsu became even more covered in drops of cold sweat, bulged his eyes in horror, and then screamed, concluding aloud that it did not help at all. However, just a couple or 3 seconds later, there was a loud bang. Ratsu fell to the ground, and the vine disappeared. Trent froze. The young man squeezed his eyes shut and trembled, simultaneously reporting that it was very painful. Ratsu concluded to himself at that moment that this was a real battle. The monster growled loudly in anger. Ratsu took the sword with his trembling hand and prepared to attack, thinking confidently to himself that he had promised his older sister Ruby Blood that he would definitely catch up with her. After a certain period of time, Ratsu returned home, bruised and swollen. The worried mother looked at the young man and noticed the fact that he had run away, to which the exhausted Ratsu replied with firm agreement. The next day, Ratsu, already more confident in himself, began to fight with the same tree monster Trent again. Ratsu once again attacked Trent with a blow of his rusty sword into the bark. But that only made Trent angrier. The young man looked at his sword and shouted that he had failed again, since this rusty F-rank sword was as blunt as a stick. Trent became furious and growled, preparing to attack the young man. Noticing this, Ratsu shouted back. The next day, young people passing by who went to the forest to get firewood froze in shock. Noticing how Ratsu was desperately fighting that tree monster Trent again, one of those young men called his brother and asked what it was. To which the same brother, in shock, wondered what Ratsu was doing here. The next day, Ratsu continued to fight the tree monster, trying to defeat it. The next day, Ratsu continued to fight the tree monster again, trying to defeat it. It's been 3 years since Ratsu desperately tried to fight that monster Trent with his rusty F-rank sword. Two girls were standing on the embankment and talking about something. The blonde girl waved her hand to the side and asked her dark-haired friend about why she should not leave this village. To which the girl asked her friend what about the job. The surprised blonde girl immediately asked again that there weren't a lot of jobs in the capital. At that moment, Trent's vine was crawling towards those girls. Several creepy tree monsters surrounded those girls and began to growl. The girls bulged their eyes in shock and fell silent, just looking at those monsters. At the same moment, Ratsu appeared above the girls' heads. He landed on the ground in front of them. Then the young man pulled his eyebrows together, preparing for an attack. He took turns dealing with each tree monster with his rusty F-rank sword. When only the monster was left, Ratsu turned to the girls with a smile on his face and reported that Trent was approaching the entrance to the village. But now everything is fine, since those girls are not injured. At the same moment, something swept past the young man at great speed. Ratsu froze in shock, still smiling. However, after glancing at the tree monster, which screamed in hellish pain at the same second, the young man froze in surprise. That's when Ratsu saw that the arrow had stuck into that monster, and that's why it was screaming. Then the young man turned his gaze towards those girls. The dark-haired girl giggled and, covering her mouth with her hand, noticed the fact that her friend was able to defeat this tree monster. A blonde girl with a bow in her hand immediately asked Rats if he was injured or not. Then this girl thanked the young man for his help. Ratsu, discouraged, only looked at those two girls in shock and laughed. After a certain period of time, Ratsu sat in the clearing with his rusty F-rank sword and concluded aloud that it had been 3 whole years since Ruby Blood left the village. Ratsu then began to wonder how much closer he had come to Ruby Blood in those 3 years. The young man opened the status window and saw that he still possessed a rusty F-rank sword, but had already reached the 10th level. Ratsu also found out that his sacred power began to amount to 15 points. However, Ratsu's stamina, agility, magic, and vitality were still 0 points. Apart from all this, Ratsu also still did not possess any magic or any skills. However, Ratsu's strength level increased from 10 maximum points to a maximum of 15 points. After reading all this, the young man sighed heavily and with sadness in his voice aloud concluded that the result of 3 years of training is only the 10th level. Then Ratsu sighed again and began to wonder aloud if he really didn't have any talent after all. Ratsu abruptly picked up the book. And then he closed his eyes and confidently decided to himself that he should work harder. Knitting his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose, the young man sighed, also realizing to himself the fact that he could not catch up with his older sister Ruby Blood. Suddenly, a voice was heard, which loudly enough noticed the fact that Ratsu had come to the forest clearing again. The young man immediately got up from the ground and began to look out for someone. A few moments later, Ratsu saw those same young men with firewood. Ratsu breathed out a sigh of relief, noticing to himself that these were the same brothers who collected and sold firewood. Suddenly, the young man with the axe pulled his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and reminded Rats that he had been training here for 3 whole years. Then this young man with an axe asked Rats that didn't he understand that it was useless. Hearing this, Ratsu pursed his lips. After some time, Ratsu sat on the ground under a tree and recalled the image of his older sister Ruby Blood, who promised the young man that she would wait for him. Ratsu, saddened by the recent words of the lumberjack brothers, sighed heavily and began to turn to his older sister Ruby Blood, simultaneously suggesting that this girl had probably gone so far that the young man himself would no longer be able to catch up with her. At that moment, Ratsu's eyes began to gradually close, and the young man himself began to fall asleep. However, Ratsu suddenly heard a loud scream and abruptly opened his eyes. At the same second, the young man got to his feet and abruptly ran through the forest, simultaneously shouting questions about what had happened and was it really a child screaming. Continuing to run, Ratsu carefully looked around and shouted with a question that a child had really got lost here. Suddenly, the young man saw the little girl and his eyes bulged in shock. Coming closer, Ratsu froze when he saw a little girl who looked very much like Ruby Blood surrounded by monsters. For a second, Ratsu even wondered if it was Ruby Blood. However, then suddenly something seemed to click in the young man's head, and he abruptly remembered that when they were little, Ruby Blood got lost in this forest, and then she was attacked by monsters. Coming out of his thoughts, Ratsu immediately armed himself with his rusty sword and began to wonder if he should help that girl. At the same moment, a small Ratsu appeared next to him, who shouted loudly, telling those monsters to move away from Ruby Blood. Hearing Ratsu's screams and crying, the monster stopped growling and even moved back. That's when baby Ratsu grabbed little Ruby Blood by the hand and abruptly began to run away screaming. Looking at all this from the outside, the already adult Ratsu raised his eyebrows in surprise and wondered if it was really him when he was little. After walking a little forward, Ratsu heard the puffing of the little Ruby Blood and Ratsu running. Hiding in the bushes, the adult Ratsu saw how the baby Ratsu calmed Ruby Blood and told her that everything was fine now, since those monsters were gone. Ratsu handed a twig with leaves to Ruby Blood and told her not to cry in that case. Wiping away tears, baby Ruby Blood smiled and said that everything was fine, and she wasn't crying anymore. At the same time, the already adult Ratsu was shocked to see the same stick with leaves in the trembling hand of baby Ratsu and wondered to himself if this stick had really saved them. Looking at how baby Ratsu laughs and says that, of course, Ruby Blood does not cry, and the older sister says that she is fine and does not cry, the adult Ratsu began to sweat with surprise because of that stick. Suddenly, baby Ruby Blood found herself next to an adult Ratsu, and then asked the young man if it was true that Ratsu was going to become a cool hero. The adult Ratsu opened his mouth in surprise and looked at baby Ruby Blood. Breaking into a wide smile, baby Ruby Blood announced that she would be looking forward to this day. Also, little Ruby Blood noticed that she would be waiting for rats. At that moment, Ratsu slowly opened his eyes and realized with a slight surprise that it was just a dream. After that, Ratsu picked up his rusty F-rank sword and smiled confidently. Along the way he turned to Ruby Blood and asked her to wait for him, because the young man would definitely catch up with her. Already walking along the forest path, Ratsu suddenly heard someone shouting very loudly. The young man immediately began to sweat and began to shake his head from side to side. Ratsu wondered to himself at that moment if he was still asleep. However, literally in 1 second Ratsu firmly realized the fact that this was not a dream at all, and he had to rush to the rescue. After some time, Ratsu still found a little scared girl with blonde hair and immediately screamed, asking her if she was okay. However, after looking more closely, Ratsu saw that there was a huge werewolf standing next to that girl, who was armed with a large sword. Opening his mouth in horror and covered with drops of cold sweat, Ratsu immediately began to wonder why there was such a monster in this forest. Swallowing, Ratsu raised his eyebrows and began to wonder how he could defeat the demon. A young man named Ratsu looked at the creepy monster and remembered fragments of information that demons, unlike other monsters, have intelligence. Ratsu also recalled that these demon monsters receive treasures and artifacts from evil deities in the same way that humans receive sacred treasures from the gods. Ratsu stared in horror at the huge demonic wolf and silently realized the fact that these demons are the enemies of humanity. Suddenly, Ratsu, covered in drops of cold sweat, heard the voice of those same lumberjack brothers. One of the lumberjacks pulled his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and wondered in shock if someone was joking with them. Then the lumberjack brothers abruptly ran away. Ratsu, shocked, ran after those young men. Catching up with one of them, Ratsu shouted loudly, asking to wait. The young man with the axe began shouting in response, simultaneously asking Rats what he needed. Then that young man frowned and started shouting that they should run away from here as soon as possible. Ratsu came out of the bushes and finally stopped those two lumberjack brothers. Ratsu then started shouting, asking those young people if they would really leave that little girl alone and run away. Ratsu started shouting that they had to save this little girl. The young man with the axe opened his mouth in shock, and then shouted a question about what this Ratsu was talking about at all, because there was a demon standing there. The second brother, who always carried firewood, began to assert that calling the village guards was the most important priority in this situation. Knitting his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose, the young man with an axe in his hands informed the shocked and naive rats that a demon grows when it kills a person, just as a person who defeats a demon receives a blessing. Then that young man and his brother shouted loudly in unison that this demon would eventually kill them all. Ratsu couldn't stand it and grabbed one of the lumberjacks by the arms, and then began to shake and scream, saying that while this little girl was waiting for the guards, she would simply be killed. Ratsu then reminded that young man with the axe that he had an artifact, so they needed to fight. That young man couldn't stand it and threw Rats aside, simultaneously shouting in his voice that his artifact was only of the D rank. While Ratsu was recovering from a sufficiently strong blow from that young man, the lumberjack brothers abruptly and quickly began to run away towards the village. That young man with the axe kept shouting along the way, telling Rats that his artifact was not suitable for combat. The second brother, the woodcutter, shouted that if they did not inform the village guards about this, then the village itself would definitely be in danger. Suddenly, Ratsu picked up his rusty F-rank sword and walked towards the place where that demonic wolf and the little girl were standing. Coming to the very place, Ratsu froze abruptly when he saw how that little girl was trembling violently with fear and crying. The pupils of Ratsu's eyes gradually contracted when the young man saw how this demonic wolf swung his sharp sword and began to inform that little girl in tears that he would receive a weak boost from such a small bug. Then that demonic wolf called that little girl a bug again and informed her that it was time to die. When the demonic wolf almost hit the girl with his sword, at the same second Ratsu appeared behind him, who in a firm and confident voice told the demonic wolf to move away from this girl. The demonic wolf froze in surprise for a few seconds, and then turned around and immediately bared his teeth, asking Rats in an evil voice what kind of nonsense it was. The young man continued to cast a stern look at the demonic wolf and tell him in a creepy and confident voice to move away from that little child. Upon hearing this, the demonic wolf laughed out loud and asked Rats about what he had just said. While continuing to grin, the demonic wolf noticed that Ratsu's voice was so quiet that he did not hear it. At the same moment, Ratsu abruptly and confidently charged, simultaneously shouting at this monster that he was telling him to move away from this little girl. However, as soon as Ratsu was near the demonic wolf, he completely stopped the young man with just a flick of his hand, grabbing his rusty F-rank sword. Upon seeing this, Ratsu pulled his eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and froze in shock, not at all expecting such a turn of events. The demonic wolf suddenly began to examine the rusty F-rank sword that belonged to Rats, and with surprise in his voice began to report that he thought what kind of garbage it was. Then, the demonic wolf was even more surprised when he realized that this rusty F-rank sword was a sacred treasure. The demonic wolf immediately released Rats and his rusty sword, and then began to laugh very loudly, simultaneously informing the young man that this whole situation makes him laugh. Then, when Ratsu was able to assume a more stable position, the demonic wolf drew his sinuous sword and in a loud voice told the young man to look at the real artifact. After that, the demonic wolf waved his sword to the side and with confidence in his voice announced that he would show what this sword was capable of. Ratsu froze in horror at the same moment. He saw how the powerful power of this demonic wolf began to destroy trees with just one movement. When all the trees around collapsed, the demonic wolf announced with confidence and even with pride in his voice that this was the power of his sword. That's when the little girl couldn't stand it. Squatting down, the little girl covered her head with her hands and began to scream, asking to be saved. Hearing the little girl scream, Ratsu pulled his eyebrows together in horror and immediately wondered to himself if demons really had such colossal power. Then, in horror, the young man began to wonder to himself if his older sister Ruby Blood was really fighting the same strong and creepy demons. Suddenly, Ratsu's body began to tremble violently when the young man realized to himself the fact that he was definitely not a rival to this demonic wolf. Then the young man decided to himself that he needed to buy some time until the guards came. However, at the same moment, a demonic wolf suddenly appeared behind Ratsu's back. Clenching his fists, the demonic wolf bared his teeth and, with a shout in his voice, asked Ratsu about where all the audacity of the young man had gone. Then the demonic wolf stuck out his tongue and, calling Ratsu a little fool, told him to die. Ratsu turned around and looked in horror at the demonic wolf, who at that moment concentrated his energy inside the sword. After just a moment, Ratsu and the demonic wolf crossed their swords at the same time. However, the demonic wolf was stronger, and it was for this reason that the young man was blown away by a powerful wave of force. There was an explosion. The demonic wolf took a step back. Ratsu squeezed his eyes shut and screamed loudly. The demonic wolf threw his sharp sword on his back and yawned, saying in a bored voice that he would not receive any special blessing from that little fish. However, then the demonic wolf clacked his teeth and with a satisfied intonation in his voice announced that the smell of people was coming here. The demonic wolf immediately concluded out loud that this meant that there was a village nearby. Ratsu was breathing heavily. The little girl sat on the ground in horror, and bitter and salty tears did not stop pouring from her eyes. The demonic wolf, looking at all this, immediately announced out loud that he would go there and collect many blessings. Licking his lips, the demonic wolf made a creepy expression and noticed the fact that he would collect many blessings due to the fact that 06 would kill all the villagers. Ratsu froze with bulging eyes, and cold sweat began to flow from his face in streams. The demonic wolf began to approach the little girl and in a confident voice inform her that he would first deal with these little losers, meaning rats and that little girl. When the demonic wolf approached that little girl, he informed her that she was about to die and was about to stab her with his sword, but suddenly Ratsu screamed loudly. He ran towards the demonic wolf, intending to attack it. When the young man was practically behind the demonic wolf, the monster turned around and tried to counterattack Ratsu. However, the young man and the demonic wolf crossed swords again. Ratsu bared his teeth, continuing to press his rusty sword towards the demonic wolf. Suddenly, the demonic wolf let out a chuckle and told Rats to accept his praise for the fact that the young man had a very good punch. However, then the demonic wolf announced that it was over. Casting a creepy glance at the young man, the demonic wolf called Rats a heroic fish and informed him that they would see each other later. Then the demonic wolf began to press harder and harder on the rusty F-rank sword until it began to crack. Ratsu squeezed his eyes shut for a few seconds from the tension. And then his eyes bulged in shock when he saw that his rusty F-rank sword was simply crumbling. Ratsu got distracted. Literally, just 1 second of delay gave the demonic wolf the opportunity to sharply kick Rats and push the young man aside. Ratsu flew several meters back and landed unsuccessfully on his back. The young man grunted in pain. The demonic wolf, at this time, almost left, but suddenly turned around and announced in a stern voice that he would kill the young man after he dealt with that little girl. The demonic wolf walked towards the little girl. Ratsu remained lying on the ground. Privately, at this moment, Ratsu asked his older sister Ruby Blood for forgiveness for the fact that he would not be able to keep his promise again. Recalling the moments of his time with Ruby Blood, Ratsu reflected to himself that he could not keep his first promise, and then even the promise of just catching up with his older sister. The young man also did not keep. Glancing at the broken rusty F-rank sword, Ratsu turned to Ruby Blood in his mind and asked her if it was true that she wasn't angry with the young man. However, Ratsu suddenly realized in his mind the fact that he is the only one who can protect this little child right now. Ratsu gripped the hilt of the rusty sword tightly with his hand. The demonic wolf froze for a second when he felt some movement behind him. At that moment, Rats managed to get up from the ground, holding a rusty sword in his hands. The demonic wolf turned back slightly and became alert. Scratched and dripping with red liquid, Ratsu breathed heavily and thought to himself that even if he died here, he would still defeat this demonic wolf. At the same moment, Ratsu and the demonic wolf attacked each other, once again crossing their swords. However, suddenly Ratsu's sword lit up and began to crack even more. Ratsu and the demonic wolf froze in shock. Ratsu turned his gaze to his rusty sword and carefully looked at what would happen to it next. After seeing how the rust began to come off the sword, the demonic wolf was covered with drops of cold sweat and began to wonder in shock how it happened in the first place. Ratsu lowered his gaze and closed his eyes. Suddenly, the young man opened his eyes and saw a cursed magic sword of S rank in his hands. After opening the status window, Ratsu found out that his level was now unknown, and his divine power was 500 points. In addition, strength, agility, durability, magic power, and endurance also increased by 500 points. Ratsu did not possess magic yet, but he received a skill called Artifact Synthesis. The demonic wolf took a step back due to the shock. Furrowing his brows, the demonic wolf began to get nervous and shout questions about what had happened at all, and whether the boy, referring to Ratsu, and his artifact in the form of a rusty sword had changed. Ratsu then noticed the fact that the rank had changed from F to S. Ratsu immediately wondered to himself if this was the true form of his partner. Ratsu himself was breathing heavily, silently noticing the fact that the power was overflowing his body. The demonic wolf, without thinking twice, decided to attack the young man. Ratsu calmly blocked the demonic wolf's attack. He gave him a stern look. The demonic wolf made a nervous expression and screamed, simultaneously informing the young man that he did not like his eyes. Then the demonic wolf went berserk because of the excitement and began to strike rats one by one. While the demonic wolf was trying to attack the young man, he shouted loudly, telling rats to speak if he had something to say, and not look like that. However, the last blow of the demonic wolf ended up simply hitting the ground. At the same moment, Ratsu himself appeared, who sharply attacked that demonic wolf with words of reminder of what he had said to this monster from the very beginning. The demonic wolf grunted in pain and screamed in horror, asking Rats about what he had said. The young man cast a stern look at the demonic wolf and reminded him that he had told the demonic wolf to stay away from that little child from the very beginning. Ratsu glanced to the side, cursing under his breath, and then wondering what the hell was going on. The young man concluded to himself that the power began to overwhelm his evolved artifact. Then Ratsu cast a stern glance in the direction of the demonic wolf and confidently decided to himself that he did not want to lose at all. At that moment, the already very nervous demonic wolf began to scream, calling the young man a fool and reporting that Ratsu's attack on him only angered the demonic wolf even more. Pointing with a clawed paw at his chest wound, which Ratsu had recently made, the demonic wolf, trying to hide the strong trembling in his body, reported that it was just a scratch. Then the demonic wolf bared its teeth and sharply attacked Ratsu again, simultaneously shouting death wishes to the young man. However, Ratsu dodged a series of attacks from the demonic wolf and eventually struck him again. The demonic wolf trembled with excitement and pain, growling along the way. Then the demonic wolf suddenly became enraged and began to release its bright energy in order to concentrate it in his sword. Seeing this, Ratsu froze and opened his eyes wide in surprise. Sweating profusely, the young man asked the demonic wolf if it was magic. The demonic wolf seemed to be in himself, shouting out loud something about magic and that it was impossible. After that, the demonic wolf shouted something about black flames and rushed to attack. However, Ratsu attacked the demon with his sword at lightning speed. The young man stood in place for a few seconds and assessed the situation, and then turned on his heel and began to leave. The demonic wolf began to tremble even more and shout the words that it was simply impossible. Starting to gradually dissolve and disappear, the demonic wolf screamed heart-rendingly, wondering how such a dirty artifact could defeat him. After a few moments, only one sword remained of the demonic wolf. Ratsu himself at that moment was shocked to realize the fact that he himself had defeated the demon. Just a couple of seconds later, the young man lost consciousness and collapsed. Losing consciousness, Ratsu heard about how that little girl ran up to him and how she called him brother. Ratsu was also able to hear that this little girl was asking the young man if he was okay. However, Rats was no longer able to answer. After some time, Ratsu woke up at home in bed. As soon as Rats got out of bed, his foster mother immediately appeared, who noticed the fact that the young man had woken up. Ratsu looked at his foster mother in surprise and immediately called her. The foster mother put a plate of sliced apples on the table and, with a slight smile on her face, briefly informed that the village guards had brought a young man from the forest. Surprised, Ratsu uttered the words about the guards out loud, and at that moment he remembered that someone had shouted for brother at that time. Ratsu then asked his mother about what happened to that little girl. However, the foster mother abruptly interrupted Ratsu and, without letting the young man finish a word, immediately informed him that if Ratsu was talking about that little girl, then everything was fine with her. Hearing this, Ratsu immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Suddenly, the foster mother sat down on the young man's bed and, with a smile on her face, informed him that for the past 3 years, in truth, she wanted Ratsu to stop going to fight monsters. Ratsu immediately cried out in surprise. The woman sighed and reported that her parents were not strong and were almost ragamuffins until they took up farming. Ratsu was surprised again, thinking about the ragamuffins. However, then the foster mother reported that she was glad that she had not forbidden the young man to fight monsters. The woman immediately told that the little girl whom Ratsu had saved had thanked him in tears of happiness. Smiling broadly, that woman noticed with pride in her voice the fact that Ratsu was getting stronger. Hearing this, Ratsu blushed deeply from embarrassment, and salty tears of happiness began to appear in his eyes. Pursing his lips because of crying, Ratsu immediately called his mother. Suddenly, the woman changed the subject and asked Rats if it was true that the young man was going to take the exam in order to become an adventurer. Still red-faced due to his intense embarrassment, Ratsu replied with an uncertain agreement, and then informed that he knew that his foster mother needed help. However, suddenly Mom hugged the surprised Ratsu and told him to promise her one thing. When Ratsu nodded slightly, the woman asked the young man to promise her not to die before her mother. Ratsu's mouth dropped open in shock. Then the foster mother closed her eyes and also added her request that the young man protect ordinary people. At the same moment, salty tears flowed from Ratsu's eyes, and he began to stroke his mother on the back and say that he would definitely fulfill his promises. Privately, at this moment, the young man concluded that he was glad that he had such a mother. Then the woman began to add to that promise more requests that Ratsu come every 6 months and save money and eat well, and especially not go to bed with a full belly. Ratsu, discouraged, immediately asked his mother again that, unless this is one promise. After some time, Ratsu stood on the mountain and looked at his village. At that moment, the young man was thinking to himself that it had already been 3 years since Ruby Blood left. Ratsu then rejoiced at the fact that his adventure was finally beginning. The young man also noticed the fact that the target is a city of novice adventurers called White Rondo. Ratsu put his hand on his chest and with confidence in his voice announced that he would definitely pass the exam and become an adventurer. However, the young man took his sword out of its scabbard in a panic and noticed in horror the fact that his S-rank sword had once again turned back into a rusty F-rank sword. Ratsu, agitated, immediately began to wonder why his sword had rusted again. Then Ratsu made a tired expression and, remembering those very brothers of the lumberjacks, said that it was still awkward, even though they made the scabbard as an apology. After that, Ratsu pulled his rusty sword out of its scabbard and decided to find out what kind of skill it was called evolution. After opening the status window, Ratsu immediately found out that a skill called evolution helps the user to release the true form of a sacred artifact, as well as activate the effect by burning the fighting spirit. When Ratsu saw the words about fighting spirit, he was surprised and immediately asked again. The young man then concluded that he was desperate when he fought that demonic wolf. After that, Ratsu closed his eyes and focused on his rusty sword. Ratsu confidently decided to himself at this moment that he would definitely become an adventurer. Then the young man also told himself to become such a hero who would be able to protect his mother and older sister Ruby Blood. At the same moment, the rusty sword of rank F cracked again and transformed into a cursed magic sword of rank S. Ratsu's mouth dropped open in a mixture of surprise and delight. To himself, the young man immediately happily noticed the fact that he had done this. Ratsu also concluded that this skill called evolution can be activated even by this method. After that, Ratsu began to carefully examine his sword. Raising his eyebrows in surprise, the young man concluded aloud that looking at this cursed magic sword of S rank, it looked like a demon artifact. Ratsu then decided to compare his sword with the sword of that demonic wolf that he had just received. The young man looked carefully at one and the second sword, and then concluded that these swords were really similar. Ratsu also noticed to himself the fact that he received the sword of the demonic wolf quite randomly, since the guard who helped the young man brought both swords, since he did not know which of these swords actually belonged to Ratsu. Ratsu suddenly realized in shock that he could see the characteristics of other artifacts. Realizing this, the young man immediately opened the status window and found out that it was a large black flame sword of rank B. After reading all this information, Ratsu cast a tired glance at the big sword and, remembering the face of that demonic wolf, noticed the fact that he could not leave this sword at home, so he took it. However, the young man was also aware that he could not fight with someone else's sacred artifact. However, at the same second, the swords in the young man's hands shot up sharply. Ratsu immediately began to panic from shock and shout the question of what was going on. At that moment, both swords touched each other and then merged into one. The new sword fell sharply and stuck into the ground. Ratsu took a step back from the shock and then shouted a question about what it was. Picking up the sword, the young man immediately found out that it was the same cursed magic sword of S rank with an unknown level and 500 points of sacred power. Ratsu immediately opened the status window and double-checked that strength, stamina, magic, vitality and agility also had 500 points each. The black flame magic called the Infernal Flash and artifact synthesis were added to his sword. The strength of his weapon was also 500 units. After reading all this information, the young man focused on the very black flame, which was the skill of the demonic wolf. Bulging his eyes in surprise, Ratsu immediately concluded to himself that he had added magic and a skill called Synthesis of Sacred Weapons. After that, Ratsu, surprised, slightly furrowed his eyebrows and wondered what kind of skill it was. After opening the status window, the young man found out that thanks to this skill called Artifact Synthesis, it is possible to synthesize a sacred artifact with the blessing of an evil god as a strengthening material. After receiving the magic of synthesized sacred artifacts, he will be able to use it. This skill was limited to unequipped sacred treasures. After reading all this information, Ratsu said with admiration in his voice that this synthesis is such an incredible skill. Then the young man concluded to himself that that demonic wolf had used black flame magic back then, and now this magic was synthesized into his artifact. Smiling innocently, Ratsu noticed aloud that it looked like a cheat weapon, even though the status was only 500 points. At the same time, the tree monster Trent began to slowly creep up on the young man with the help of his vine. Ratsu, surprised, froze for a second, even though there were already a dozen of these Trents behind him. Turning around, the young man asked about the monsters with a calm expression on his face. One of the Trents attacked him with energy from his mouth. Ratsu immediately jumped back. And then he sighed and confidently held out his cursed magic sword of S rank in front of him. Stroking the base of the sword, Ratsu closed his eyes and told the sword to bestow magic called Black Flame. At the same moment, a strong stream of dark and bright energy came out of the sword, which immediately began to attack each of these tree monsters. In a few moments, the Trents literally burned down, leaving behind only ashes. Seeing how the young man incinerated all his relatives, the surviving Trent was covered with drops of cold sweat from horror and squeaked loudly. Ratsu, meanwhile, was smiling happily and concluding out loud that it really worked, and he himself could use magic. However, at the same second, the young man felt something. Ratsu immediately grabbed his head and began shouting a question about what kind of nonsense was going on. Trent looked at it in surprise. Ratsu fell to the ground and trembled violently. At that moment, the young man was wondering what was going on and why his head was splitting. Then the young man cast a glance in the direction of his cursed magic sword of S rank and with tears of pain in his eyes began to wonder what kind of curse it was. Seeing that Ratsu was unable to do anything, Trent squeaked and then pulled out his vine and began to attack the young man. Ratsu glanced towards the tree monster and froze in horror as he realized that there was no way for him to dodge in this situation. However, a girl suddenly appeared and screamed, telling the young man not to move. Ratsu froze in shock and squeezed his eyes shut. However, nothing happened. Trent didn't attack. Opening his eyes, the young man saw that Trent did not attack him only because the same girl stood in front of him with a shield in her hands and did not give the tree monster the opportunity to attack them. Turning towards the lying young man, that blonde girl asked Rats if he was okay. Ratsu looked at the girl as if mesmerized and asked in surprise in his voice about who was okay. After a certain period of time, Ratsu arrived in the same city for novice adventurers. Looking at the architecture and the people around, the young man noticed to himself that this is about what